Hi everyone, Zzarchov Kowolski is my favorite adventure designer. Before I even start, go check out his products and his Neoclassical Geek Revival Kickstarter, which he is running right now. Links will be in the video description. Just get it and you won't regret. And now to continue, I am really grateful that he agreed to have this conversation, and I have to say that I was a bit stressed when we were talking. Because I had so much stuff in my mind I wanted to ask that I ended up forgetting half of it. This interview is also a bit different than the previous ones, since it's only audio without video cams. Also, our connection dropped twice and we had to restart, so in some moments there will be a different flow of the conversation, but I will inform you about the cuts. Now a short introduction in Polish and the interview will start. Cześć wszystkim. Po pierwsze, wszyscy wiecie, że Zzarchov Kowolski to mój ulubiony przygodopisarz. Po drugie, Kickstarter jego gry Neoclassical Geek Revival oraz link do jego produktów będzie w opisie wideo. Po trzecie, bardzo zestresowałem się tą rozmową. Nie chciałem jej spieprzyć, ale mam wrażenie, że ze swojej strony zawiodłem. Na szczęście Zzarchov jest niesamowity i jego przemyślenia to czyste złoto. Ten wywiad jest jedynie w postaci audio, a Zzarchowa odwiedziła bardzo silna burza, która sprawiła, że dwukrotnie zerwało nam połączenie. Mam jednak nadzieję, że ten wywiad Wam się spodoba. Hello, Zzarchov. Thank you very much for having this conversation. I'm really thrilled to hear about stuff that I want to talk to you because, like I said a few seconds ago, I really like your work, and I have recently played it, and I have some questions, especially about how it was designed, what was the thought process. But maybe for the beginning, if you could shortly introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hello, I'm Zzarchov Kowolski. I write a number of adventures and a game system, Neoclassical Geek Revival. I've done work with Lamentations of the Flame Princess, with Zero Barrier, with Do-It-Yourself Publishing, a handful of other things along that line. And yeah, I'm calling from Canada.
Okay, so like I said, I will jump straight to the questions because I have a few. So my first would be this: OSR modules are usually, when they are written for players. Like they have challenges for players, they have challenges for people, for persons. But very rarely they touch player characters. Sometimes they even go a step further and treat them as tools. And this is something that I find really curious in your products, because they don't treat player characters as tools for the game. And sometimes they have such interesting things going on, and that player characters are easily taken into the adventure, into the stuff that is going on, into the process, and I wanted to ask if this is something that you think when you write an adventure, write a module, that there has to be something in for the player character, not only for the player, or this is something that I just made up and you never think about such a thing.
Well, if I can paraphrase a bit to make sure I understand correctly, you're kind of pointing out how there is, to a certain extent, there is an event going on whether or not the players get involved. Yeah. And I think to a point that, that is not just something that I planned, but that everyone should have in an adventure, that there needs to be an underlying event or commotion or something that is going on to create a sense of urgency. Otherwise, all you're going to have is a tourist location waiting for the convenient group of adventurers to show up, which, I mean, I guess that could be fine every now and again, but it kind of robs the ability to have the game have that kind of dynamism of having an issue that, even if you don't need to deal with it, that it will resolve itself.
But what I'm thinking about also is that sometimes there are in modules you have this fun stuff, for example, traps, traps or puzzles, but they are for the player, not for the player character. And also, for example, in Scenic Dunnsmouth, you are creating a cast of very interactive characters, which NPCs. So and player character can easily dig in to these events, and that's also what I was asking. If you think that player character has to engage with the environment, not only with the challenges, or maybe I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, I mean that is kind of the nature of the adventure, right? Scenic Dunnsmouth, especially, it is designed in such a way that you almost, assuming that you're not completely avoiding doing anything at all, and even still, it's pretty hard in that adventure particularly, you're going to inadvertently stumble into things. The hooks are specifically designed, for example, the tax collector hook. No one has any money, so if you buy the debt and you're entitled to the debt, you're going to go basically start state-sanctioned looting, and as you're doing that, unless you are for some reason running that in a super polite, respectful way where you assume no one's holding out on you and everything goes smoothly, you're going to start getting into the back parts of people's homes, and spoiler alert, you're going to start encountering things that then ratchet it up. It takes a great deal of effort in that adventure by design to not get entangled in things.
Yeah. So with keeping with Scenic Dunnsmouth, as you have said, that there is a design behind of it, and I wanted also to ask about the design for the non-player characters, because there is a lot of them and they are very interactive, as I have said. And is it tough to create such a cast of characters for the adventure? And was it the toughest process of this whole product? Because it's a lot of them, and they also have almost every single one of them has these two sides. If they are infected, if they are not infected. So was this a challenge for you, or was this a challenge for you?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, and I think one of the things to differentiate is there are things that are hard to come up with and do, and then there are things that are tedious to do.
Mm-hmm.
And due to the volume, that was definitely a tedious task, but it wasn't difficult. Functionally, once you know what the design is, which is that each character has to have a way, really there's two sides of it, but they have to have something about them that has a risk of hooking at least one type of play, either as a player or player character, to get them involved and therefore to cause trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone doesn't have to appeal to everything. Some characters for some play styles should be completely fine. You don't run into any troubles with them off the top, but just numerically, the odds are that there is going to be some character somewhere in there that will hook one or more of the players or player characters, and then kind of cause the whole thing to come crashing down and thereby cause an adventure. So I wouldn't say it's difficult, but it is definitely tedious. That is unfortunately one of the things that is not the hardest, but perhaps the hardest to motivate yourself to do when you have done all of the interesting parts of adventure design, and then it is boiled down to the parts that you need to do that are not fun to do.
It is funny that you are saying that it is not fun to do, because I was even thinking that this is the most fun part for you when you are doing the adventure, and I will say because you always have very interesting NPCs in your models, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, and that I'm quite shocked that you said it, because I really think that you have very good NPCs, and some of your models, like for example the Punchline and Scenic Dunnsmouth, they are based almost based on the NPCs. So
Oh, absolutely. And I don't want to imply that there's no fun in creating or no joy in creating any of the characters. But the notes that you would create for yourself and then the amount of detail that you would need to have someone else run it, that gap is where kind of the death of joy in
Yeah.
the actual producing something is. And if you have a lot of NPCs, like there is in Scenic Dunnsmouth, you're going to run into that a lot more. You can't just have, a note that references a person that you know in real life that you as a game master can use to fill in all the missing details. You actually need to spell those out. Why is it important that this person has pine furniture instead of oak? What does that mean? Because people are going to have, I'm somewhat terrible at this, as I sometimes get a little more, I almost want to say petulant, towards future readers, because at least when I was young and I was reading books, they were full of words and things that I didn't understand. What the heck is a barbican? And then having to go look up that obscure piece of High Gygaxian language and all of these other things. And there's kind of a trend now to explain more and more details. One of the little pet peeves I have, but peeve is maybe the wrong word, because I actually get a little bit of smug joy out of it. And smugness is a flaw, I know that, is where I will put in details that are subtle little details that are important, and people with less understanding of the subject matter will think that is some sort of flaw instead of an intentional note.
Mm-hmm.
There were, for example, I'll try and link to Dunnsmouth. There are a number of places where people were pointing out how, things were ineffective, for example. Fences or defenses or things like that from various people in the module. But that was also to showcase intentionally that, these people don't have, access to ironworks and craftsmen and all sorts of things. Their defenses aren't perfect because they are living in a materially poor area, in a swamp that is isolated. Those were not flaws, but I would still see reviews here and there, and I generally know better than to interact with reviews, so I just look at them and kind of nod, and if ever asked about it, I'll generally thank people for their input, but
Yeah,
just the nature of it.
yeah, I get it. Yeah, so sticking with this adventure. So if the NPCs were a big effort for you, so how big was the generator? Because it seems like a really tough thing to do for this adventure, and I assume it also had to be play tested or something like that. And so along with the cast of the NPCs, it seems like it was a really tough project.
Well, the generator was a fair amount of just revision and test work. But once the idea was in there, it was just kind of finagling with the math. And a lot of that could be before you did your first test. Well, before you do your second test. The first one was just, is this even an interesting idea thematically? I started running this adventure probably back in 2010. And then Google Plus came around, which made it for a period there really easy to play test a lot of stuff. And I could run Dunnsmouth multiple times. I could have the same group run it through multiple times, and I could kind of tweak and test with math, mess with some of the NPCs if I was finding that there were patterns that were getting too common, or where things that were supposed to be unusual were happening too much. So along with anything, it's really, you just have to keep doing it over and over again until you get it right.
Yeah. So was the overall process of creating the adventure, was it long? Like from your experience right now, when you have when you have a lot of products behind you, so was it one of the biggest or not?
I don't think it's one of the big. I mean, it's one of the biggest. I guess it depends on what you consider with one of. So I definitely think it would be in the top 5.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, it's a math problem and then putting a bunch of content on it. So it's creating a good mathematical skeleton, and then on top of that, putting in the content that and ensuring that it'll all connect together to kind of repeatedly generate an adventure. And built into it to give myself some wiggle room is the idea that a small percentage of the time it should be kind of boring, under the idea that that allows you to use this multiple times. That's about, I haven't looked at the math in a while, I want to say 1 in 12, 1 in 6, that there's just no spoiler alert, no spider problem in the town, which is important for the replayability. And I've had that run a few times, though a couple of times I did have to tweak the results to generate ones to see, where if you run a group who has gone through it before, their own paranoia, as kind of on a meta level, will generate an adventure as they go witch hunting when there's no witch, as it were.
Yeah, I thought when I read the adventure and I saw that there is no spider problem, and first when I played it, I thought that, hey, this is stupid. I don't like it. I don't like it. But and then when I finished the adventure 2 times with 2 different groups, I thought that I could even play it with the same group and just take out the spider. And that would create a funny tension, I think. Yeah. So yeah, sounds like that at least.
Yeah, I mean, and that is absolutely the intention. One of the things, I guess, to kind of loop back where I have differences of opinions on a number of different designers is I try to take a bit more of a step back at what the actual thing I'm designing for is, which is not so much the play at the table so much as the table as it is. I try to view everything as a thing to create memorable events at a party, in the sense of a place where you would have music and snack foods and drinks, maybe not music, then an activity. And so I always try to set it up along that kind of taking a step back. What would be the thing that would be most useful in that, whether or not a really well-designed adventure is fun to play at the moment, to me is less interesting than what are the odds you're going to have experiences that you're still going to talk about and remember, ideally fondly, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, because we all have those stories, and they're usually not from the best games that we had at the table, not the most tactically interesting, but ones that create situations that are themselves memorable from people at a table. And so that's a lot of the type of design that went into there's a lot of things in Dunnsmouth where if you're a really smart, tactically minded group, you can probably clear through the place pretty easily, but it naturally encourages, there's almost always going to be that one person in a group who is going to mess things up. And so it really kind of feeds on that.
Yeah, no, my players, first group I had a smart group which outsmarted the cult, and second group was smart tactically, and they outplayed the cult. So second one, it was just tactically beating them, and the first one they make them believe that they are the members of the cult and they were already beaten by the spider, and that's how they sneaked inside the spider's lair and burned it. So that's how they did it. Yeah. So,
and some people might see that as a problem, but I mean, that's kind of the part of the game, right? That if you are smart, you can overcome it.
Yeah. But the satisfaction from this group that outsmarted the cult, it was great. Like, they thought that they just made up the best idea that they could, and they were super satisfied with it. So I think at the end of the day, this is what matters, and this adventure delivered it twice in a different manner. So one of the group outsmarted tactically, one of them outsmarted them with their wit, but both of them they really enjoyed it. So at the end of the day, when the session ended, they were really, really happy and satisfied. So that this is what matters for me, at least. Yeah. So with the sticking a bit with Dunnsmouth still, I wanted to ask about the generator, touch it a bit, but I noticed that in your adventures, you have a thing for math or for generating sometimes different mechanics or different dice tables. So you have this, I think in NGR you have this random encounter dice table, which is produced, correct me if I'm wrong, on D4 and D12. Yes?
I'd say D8, D6, and D4.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so these three dices, I remember in Ghoul Prince, this adventure has crazy good mechanics for this entity, and my players really enjoyed it because they didn't know what is happening, and they didn't crack what was going on, but they were super. It was super crazy fun for them to fight with it. To try to fight with it, so it was really cool, and same with Dunnsmouth, and I see this pattern that sometimes in your, of course, A Price of Evil is also some kind of a generator. So that's why what I wanted to ask: do you like it? Do you like thinking about RPG products in the manner how can you bite them from the side of the math of the random generators and etc.?
Well, the math of the random generators is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I go through the effort to try and tinker with them. The seed tables, the D8, the D6, D4, I know those are also fairly popular as a way to, people enjoy them for wilderness encounters, and I use them for that. But functionally, what I'm trying to do with them is not so much about the math as if the math is already going to be there, then it should be done as cleanly and with as large of a payout for as little effort. One of the things that I really don't like, for example, on a lot of standard encounter tables, even though it may not seem like much, is the amount of like rolling on, like just repeatedly flipping through books and different things along those lines, looking at different tables and different subtables. And I know a lot of people, it's been a standard way to try and deal with that, to then go the other way and just really simplify it. Like, oh, we'll just have one table and it's a D6 and you get one of these six things, and we pick the one that makes the best adventure. But I very much always try to square the circle as it was.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the really complicated one, you do get a better encounter. It is just disruptive to try and get that at the table. Or if you have like the more tables and the more random or the more mechanics that are more complicated. And if you make it really simpler, you know, often there's a push to make things very rules light, you lose a lot of the fidelity. And so what I always try to do is find the right blend, and doing that means making things as efficient as possible. So for example, you mentioned those tables. You know, you only roll them once and it generates both a place and a creature and something weird, and then the different combinations of the dice, and this is, I realize, me talking to a theoretical listener who isn't aware of these, give you other special modifiers, and sometimes there's multiple that'll chain up together, but it's always just one roll of the dice. And that allows you to have a lot of different things that'll interact and overlap, and you can have, as a designer, a lot of complexity, but then for the person who's actually using at the table, which is, you know, as I also use these tables, is also me,
Mm-hmm.
you get a lot of payoff for them. So, you know, the setting up the table takes a fair amount of time. I've had people ask about their formula I use, and to a certain extent, there's just a lot of, it is a bit of an art once you have the basic mechanics in to get that all working and smoothly. But then once you have that, or you bought it from me and now you already have all the tables, you can use that for large amounts of times. Like even when I have to go through and finically create one of those tables, I now have that terrain type to plug in my game from then on, and I will get, you know, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 30 to 1 return on investment for the amount of prep time I had to do, to how much actual game content do I get from those. And if you just make things very simple, it's easier prep time, but then it gets stale really fast. People didn't create the more complicated games for no reason. It's because everything started rules light. And then even if you start rules light and you go rulings, not rules, if you want to have consistency, that all builds up. It kind of accretes. You get a more complex, gets harder to, and that's, you know, kind of the history of how you had the OSR in the very beginning. like very beginning when it was just D&D and it was simple, and then just rulings got kind of bundled together, and you got the glorious mess that was AD&D, and they tried to fix that and streamline it. And so it's the same with anything. And so that means that whenever I'm putting a mechanic in a book, I'm trying to make sure that it is as efficient as possible and that it's going to get you as much game value out of it. I know that's one you're not as familiar with, but the Price of Evil also uses a card mechanic. It uses it to generate haunted houses.
Yes, I saw it. I own the anthology from the Kickstarter, and I saw that. I haven't read it through like really detailed, but I flipped it and I saw that it reminded me a bit of Dunnsmouth, but from what I saw in the introduction, it's not the same. I think, yes.
Correct. It uses different card mechanics. It doesn't have any die drops. There's a couple of layouts of a house. You have different floors, and it creates both a haunted house that is haunted by something with a different room layout and different weird things that happens. And it's designed in a way that you can use that repeatedly in the same campaign, because you're probably going to have, you probably have the possibility of having a haunted house in any long-running campaign or more than one. And so that is something that has that function where it can be used more than once. If that makes sense. Much like Dunnsmouth, it has a repeat value, much like the seed tables. You don't just get a bunch of encounters. You can use the same seed table or the collection of them for 3-4 campaigns, and they'll keep being fresh because there's always those small, weird, very low probability events that can crop up, which I think are important in anything. You see a little bit of that in the Ghoul Prince, where it has low probability events, which I know oftentimes people have said, hey, I want to have the cool thing just appear in an adventure. That's fine. But if the cool thing always appears in every adventure, it kind of ruins the value of a long-term campaign where that weird thing finally does crop up and it is weird, and people have that sense of, as you mentioned with Dunnsmouth, where there's that paranoia where people have a false sense of complacency, and then the weird thing does crop up.
Yeah, because if everything will be weird, then nothing is weird. So
I actually have a whole spiel on how every campaign eventually becomes high fantasy based on the bioaccumulation of magic, assuming you have anything supernatural in the campaign at all. And that is fine. That's not actually a problem. Because as things build up, it kind of goes up. Like the character finds their first, cursed item, magic sword, whatever it is, the first supernatural creature, and that's one, and that's interesting. But then that's always kind of existing in the back of the campaign. If they have magic item, they're going to keep it. Most of the party dies, but at least one lives. All of the cursed items or magic swords or whatever kind of stays with them, and they keep getting more and more. And eventually you can start off as early seasons Game of Thrones, and you can end up in Harry Potter, like just completely cross the genre. The more gritty and realistic you try and keep it is really just slowing down the curve. Because if a campaign goes long enough, people are going to get some weird stuff in their tool bag, and even cursed items that you think have no use. Players are pretty clever, at least as clever as the GM, and in a group probably more so. And they'll figure out weird uses for stuff. Cursed items suddenly become overpowering. It's just part of the game as more and more builds up. That's why I think having like an end level is important.
Yeah, for example, about this stuff, introducing the weird stuff. When I started my campaign, I started it with England Upturn from Lamentations and combined it with yours going through Forbidden Otherworlds and the Punchline. So I mixed all this up, and basically because of going through Forbidden Otherworlds, I introduced the supernatural events, and it is a very good module for that, because I could basically put anything I wanted inside, for example, on the table where the alien lies. So I wanted to put players somewhere on one of the 9 worlds from the Nordic mythology, and I wanted to introduce the dark elves as the villain, and I basically placed the dark elves, and it was a really cool situation because they were all humans. We were playing only humans, and this event, that like this adventure, made, even though some of the players, because we have also non-fantasy people at our table, some of the players were aware of what drow is, but it was a really cool moment where they stepped in this lab and saw this corpse of a dark elf and thought that this is a weird creature. So and why I'm telling this is because, like you stated, that there is this situation that stuff is ending on a Harry Potter level, and basically everything ends very high magic, and it's really tough for me to reach how to surprise your players with weird stuff, with sometimes, I don't know, pseudo horror stuff or things like that, when that's basically a monster of the week sometimes, and it's really tough for me to get this feeling of something being weird. I don't know if I'm clear with this, if you get me.
Absolutely, because I was kind of leading this conversation. I was then gonna like jump into the bit about the punchline, and then you started talking about going through Forbidden Otherworlds, which is also an important topic about this exact situation. But you then kind of wheeled back to the punchline, so I can talk about that a little bit. One of the things about the punchline is, as you mentioned with Monster of the Week, it is very consciously, there is nothing supernatural in that.
Yeah.
Because if you want to have that curve level out and to have things not as quickly, because it's always going to end up there, if you want to have them not as quickly go to the Harry Potter level, then you need to have like a pacing. One of the things that in old dungeon stocking guides that people have kind of lost sight of is that, you know, a third of rooms should have, you know, there's different rules for this, a monster, a third should have treasure, a third should have traps, but that they don't all need to line up, and you should have just completely empty, useless rooms, because they add that tension and that pacing. You don't know what the next room, maybe there's nothing here, because you don't know if there's something here. You don't know that every room has something. It creates that tension. And the same thing with, if you really want to have, for example, if you're playing Lamentations, you want to have that kind of grounded lower fantasy, then you need to have a lot of adventures that are not supernatural. So that was kind of one of the things I wanted to run with that. Also, you know, it was an excuse to do a clown adventure and to a little bit subvert. Like, I admit it's a dumb clown. The initial title that I wanted to pitch it with was Clown Panic 2016 Cash In, which I think only would have been funnier the longer it took to go through production hell and get out. But like a core point of that is I wanted that adventure to have no supernatural elements. I've written a few other adventures that have things for how do you run them if you don't want things supernatural. The Temple of Lies, for example, you deal with a snake cult and there's an option for are they magical or are they not? Because I think that is something that is really missing as people kind of focus more on these kind of lower, more grounded things, is that there needs to be there needs to be an opportunity to have adventures where you show up and like, oh, it's not a monster of the week, where you can kind of break that so that you can kind of make players still have an aura of skepticism. It's like if you play a Call of Cthulhu game for too long, the idea that you wouldn't suspect supernatural kind of dries up because, well, every week there's something supernatural.
Yeah.
Why are we still pretending it could be an old man in a real estate scheme? It's never that.
Yeah, it's a conversation.
Have those.
It's a conversation that I had with my friend recently, that playing Call of Cthulhu game, for us at least, is not a matter if, it's a matter of when a monster will pop up. So and which one it will be. So that's the problem. And for the punchline, it looked like a fun product to do. Was it? Was it fun to write the punchline, because it's full of jokes?
Oh, I mean, it definitely gives me, I mean, it's an adventure about clowns, and I am
Yeah.
very, but I think part of what you need to do, and part of what I think is often missed when people do things that are kind of have jokey elements like that in them, is that they can only be jokey out of character and they have to be dead serious in character.
Hmm.
Uh, One of the best examples I like to point at is that I think it's a masterwork at this is old Fallout and Fallout New Vegas. I'll focus on New Vegas because I think there's more people who have played that. They do a masterful job of taking things that to you as the player are obviously dumb jokes, but then they make them deadly serious to kind of in game, like Caesar's Legion, the big villain. I mean, they're a joke because it's Las Vegas about Caesar's Palace Casino and the waiters who go around in full Roman garb. Like, they're a dumb joke. And if you're looking at that as a player, like, it's kind of a thing where you roll your eyes and make a roll the dice gesture, like, oh, isn't that funny? But then you have to treat it in game as a serious thing. This is a real military force. They're dangerous. They like crucify people. They're horrible. They're an actual threat. And they also do it the other way in that they have like a bunch of Elvis impersonators and they create an in-game reason for them. And so that is one of the things that same type of logic that I try very hard to go with in the punchline. We're looking at it outside. Yes, this is a dumb clown adventure. Like, these are satanic clowns. That's dumb. But then I try and treat it very serious in game where, like, oh, these are people who, they are part of a deranged cult. They have reasons why they do all of these things, and they're not funny to the character, even if they are to the player. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's like you can at the first glance they are dumb, they are stupid, but then they are doing very serious stuff, and you have to treat them seriously because they are the danger of the adventure. So yeah, definitely. And also with the punchline, because I will be honest, and it was the first product, yours product, that I have read. And I remember when I was reading the punchline, and I read the line where you are describing the clown, and there is this one sentence like, this guy is the Starscream of the group, and I thought, God damn, this is genius. And you are really good at selling the NPCs and describing the adventure, how it goes. And do you is it also something that you are thinking when you are producing something or writing a book, an adventure book, any RPG product? Because you really do a really good job in taking people through your book, through your product, through the Dunnsmouth generator, through explaining people how NPCs work, how this adventure works. Is it something that is inside your head that you want readers to properly understand? Because I read some adventures even recently. I have read Death Frost Doom and played it. And Death Frost Doom is an adventure which is written really good, in a really good manner, but it's sometimes ignoring the needs of the reader. There are sometimes bits where I had to think if this is written properly and if I understand the adventure. And with you, I never had this problem. You are really smart with taking me through your product. So back to the question: is it something that you are thinking when we are creating something?
100%. It is also often something I've had constructive discussions with various editors. I guess the nicest way I've had it described is that I have a strong authorial voice. But one of the things, especially with NPCs, that I think is important is not pretending that academic textbooks are the best way to understand something.
Yeah.
There's a certain trend to try and make things very dry or very clinical. But if you were, for most people, not everybody, trying to actually explain a concept to somebody in real life, and this is what I mean about thinking about the fact that this is about people sitting around a table at a party. then descriptions like, because that is one in particular, the Starscream of the group, that I got some constructive feedback and pushback, and I had to have some pushback on. Because on the one hand, true, that only means anything if you know who Starscream is. However, I feel very confident that the majority of people who are of the age group and like all of the persuasions that they're going to be, reading the punchline, a majority of people probably know very clearly who Starscream is because they watch Transformers. And even if they didn't, they're adjacent enough that they probably have some idea. And even if you don't, then again, we go back to the way I had to learn High Gygaxian, then you will Google who Starscream is and you will look it up. We don't have to pretend like we're writing for, college textbooks in the 1970s before the internet where, this was the only thing people could use and you had to make sure people understood it fully. Because that is also something that is very visceral. I can use that one quick description and there are so many bits of information that conveys because that archetype, because again, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you had probably seen Transformers, the cartoon, before.
Of course, yes.
And so when I mentioned that it's Starscream, you know exactly who Starscream is as an archetype and what that means if someone is
exactly.
Starscream.
This one sentence sold it to me. I never had to read anything more about Clown, and I really knew what he was about. Yeah.
And so that is kind of what I mentioned. If we loop back to earlier with NPCs, I like when I can get away with a description like that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And that depends, because there are people who, in that case, I'm pretty sure there's a fairly large overlap of, people familiar. When you get to other areas, it gets a little harder because you have to have some background knowledge. So, for example, in some of the characters in Dunnsmouth, I have to explain a little more about them because they're based on characters from really, like, either real life or they're from really obscure sources. And so the shorthand in my DM notes isn't as useful. Like if I say Uncle Chuck, well, you don't know my Uncle Chuck, yeah. So that's not going to mean anything to you. But occasionally there's ones that are gems where I can use that conciseness. I can put in, he's the Starscream, and that is something that carries forward.
Yeah, I think even in Dunnsmouth you have used the that Samsons are the hillbillies and stuff like that. It's also selling the overall idea of how we can think. So yeah, definitely it really digs up. I mean, it really soaks to the brain that what is this about? Definitely. So yeah, and sticking with the adventures still, I wanted to ask about going through Forbidden Otherworlds, because this is also a product that I really enjoyed and my group really enjoyed it. And I know this adventure, GTFO, it stands out in a term that it's really easy to import to any adventure or any campaign setting, and it can take you to any adventure setting, campaign setting. And this is also something that I have noticed about your adventures, and when I was using them, it's the very same with the Ghoul Prince. Dunnsmouth is also a product that you can port basically in any even fantasy setting like Warhammer, like D&D, etc. We've had weak or there, but you can do it, definitely easy. And I also wanted to ask, when you are designing your adventures, do you think like I want this product to be easily ported anywhere, or they usually don't have any criteria on you have to start here, you need to have this in your adventure, or you need to have this, and this is never the case with your products. And yeah, this is the question: do you design with this idea?
So 100%. One of the things I try to rely very heavily on to kind of make that easier is implication, where I try to avoid specifying things that would lock it in place. I mean, for some of the Lamentations things, because it's specifically to be set in real world, there's a little bit of that. But even still, I try and keep it a bit vague. But for example, I'll reference the old Empire, or less so in the Lamentations ones, but or the Holy Church, or the old, things that are vague enough that I'm well aware most games, as much as we're all unique individual snowflakes, we also have a lot of stuff that are crib shorthands. Like, you probably have something in your game that is old and ancient and in the desert and is in a pyramid and mummies come from there and it's Egyptian-y. Like, it may not be in the forefront, but that's going to be something in your adventure. You're probably going to have an area or time where there were people that were like King Arthur. You're probably going to have something in there that was like Rome. Whether in the past or current, or heck, if you're in like a Bronze Age game, then maybe in the future. But like, there are certain things that, in a very Conan way, that are kind of their pastiches. And so it's easy enough, even if you don't know exactly, like, there are differences, like in your game, the Egyptians were ruled by necromancers who turned themselves to vampires or whatever it is, that any other British European company has changed the history of how undead come from now. I stopped following Games Workshop a while ago, spoilers for that example, but even if they're not the same as the actual, like, you can kind of, as long as it's loose enough, you can get, oh, okay, this Egyptian vase it means it comes from that area. I can plug that in. And as long as you're vague enough about it with strong implications, people can fill in the gaps for how that works. The second part of that is kind of tied to that, as you mentioned, with the gateways and whatnot. For example, in GTFO, the other two things that I try to specifically do, and this is what I try and do for every single adventure that I will bother publishing to the public, is it is trying to do something innovative to have a reason to be on a shelf, and or it is a dumb joke, ideally or. So an example, going through Forbidden Otherworlds, I'll put some spoilers here. There's a sequel, Barbarians of Orange Boiling Seas, which is one of the examples of, hey, here's what the portal in GTFO can connect to. And that was a long 2-year joke, to a certain extent, that I was pulling on LOTFP to see if I could publish 2 adventures that were boobs or GTFO, based on, in the dumbest way possible, mid to early 2000s internet slang. Which, I suppose I'm not proud of myself, but there it goes. Sometimes I am still 12 and want to make a dumb joke. But, still, they had to be good adventures. GTFO was specifically set as a concept, as it kind of winks and nods. It's a literal gateway adventure. Specifically, I saw that as a thing that would be useful because LOTFP especially is set in the real world Earth, but then there's a lot of other adventures. Very few people, I would bet, and perhaps James Raji can correct me on this, that probably use LOTFP exclusively. You're going to have adventures from other stuff, or you're going to throw them into your unique world or Forgotten Realms, or wherever you're running stuff. You're just going to plug them in. Or perhaps you're running that for your group, but you want to run in, because one of the things with GTFO is you can have that from other end. You can go from the ahistorical Earth to Forgotten Realms, or some other non-trademarked area. That's just the one that's popping in my head, but whatever game product you're buying normally, or you can go the other way. And so that can be a way that you can have little side campaigns where you go deal with some other things outside of your normal content for the players revolt and want to go back to what they're normally doing.
I mean, I don't know.
I mean, whether or not you use it that way, it was created to allow you to do that.
Yes,
so that
yes.
A game.
Exactly. What I wanted to do is I wanted to combine the OSR and the Planescape setting. So the GTFO allowed me to do it. So I basically mixed Planescape with Nordic mythology, with the Yggdrasil, with the tree, with 9 worlds, and that's how I mixed it up, and I use GTFO as a gateway to this Planescape tree.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's designed to do. So you can go, I'm doing this currently. I don't want to start a new campaign. I just want to do this other thing or move this group to that thing. They like their characters. Here's a literal gateway adventure to kind of move towards that. And also, and if you do it right, have a way that you can go back.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, this going through Forbidden Otherworlds was a point on a sandbox map. So and this is what players chose to do. So they didn't want it to chase the English Civil War. They wanted to explore the other worlds. So that's what they have chosen, and not that I have told them go there. It was their choice. Yeah. So they could stay with the English Civil War with our Earth, but they were interested in something different.
And I think the last one that we haven't talked about much, based on your initial listing, was the Ghoul Prince.
Yeah. So the Ghoul Prince, I used it, but I have also combined it with a module. I don't remember the name. Give me a second. I think it's a Tomb of the Frostwalker. It's basically a iced team dungeon, so something like that. And I have combined the Ghoul Prince and elements from the Ghoul Prince with this dungeon. But overall, Ghoul Prince is also an adventure that can be put anywhere. You also even provide this list on the beginning that in your adventure, who is that, and based on these questions, based on this list, you can create the background of the adventure itself.
And the Ghoul Prince is like the thing that is, as I mentioned, there's a purpose for why I try and make every one of the adventures, is to make it as easy as possible to integrate an adventure. That is one that is going beyond just making it not difficult, and specifically, how can I create this in a way that is as easy as possible to integrate into any campaign as a somewhat repeating method. And it's a little bit of an example of that. There's also the Ghoul Prince themselves, who are a inventively interesting opponent, I'll say, without spoiling too much.
Yes, it is. It is really
trying to get the mechanics to match the feel in a way that I think is important. As one of the things that's a whole other side conversation, but I guess to deal with the integrating of it, for those who don't know, there's sometimes been called a Mad Lib adventure because it will use very generic language throughout the adventure, but with certain bolded keywords that are then tied to a list, and you can say things like, okay, if you're going to do a winter dungeon, the thing that, shows the passage of time, like that's been undisturbed, will be frost and snow. If it's going to be, in an Egyptian tomb, then it's going to be loose sand. If it's going to be, in a swamp, then you would say, okay, it's going to have moss and mildew and things like that to show that this area hasn't been touched. The traps will be this, the type of beast monster in the area is going to be a giant spider or this, to kind of set a consistent feel while keeping the kind of underlying structure of the adventure as the parts that are the moving pieces, to make them easy to get your head around, and then you just put the flavoring so that it fits into your local game.
Yeah. So on top of this, I wanted to ask, because you have also touched the dungeon topic, and sorry for jumping, because I was thinking about this when you started this description. Do you like creating dungeons? Because they are not, at least from what I am familiar with, although going through Forbidden Otherworlds is a dungeon, they are not such a big part of your products. So do you like it, or do you, because usually OSR modules are, when people think of an OSR module, they think of a dungeon, and I think with you it's a bit different. So Yeah.
I do like dungeons, but as I mentioned, one of the things that if I'm writing an adventure, it has to be doing something I think better or new or more interesting that doesn't already exist. And the problem with dungeons, at least for me, is there are 40 years of some very good dungeons. So I would, if I'm putting something out that's a dungeon, it has to be doing something that isn't already done better. So there's a couple of dungeons I've done. You mentioned at one point, I think you said that City of Tears or Tears, you're not sure which one it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
As a dungeon. And for example, the only thing about that is the reason that I put that out is because that is made rather than, dual stated as a lot of my own self-published adventures are. That one's purely a Neoclassical Geek Revival adventure. And that is the thing it does is showcase how the dungeons work a little different there than a pure OSR game. And so that's its point of existing. But otherwise, it's, fairly solid, interesting, dungeon, I like to think. But I wouldn't, for example, have created that as an OSR dungeon because there are OSR dungeons who would do that, except, as good or better. So wouldn't really have a lot of use. There is a dungeon that I'll spill a little bit that is probably going to come out at, actually, who knows how long, production. I just started moving away from that. My 4-dimensional hyper dungeon.
Oh.
And the thing about that is that it is a dungeon in 4 dimensions. So it is a large dungeon. I think it's 220 or so rooms. But the interesting thing about that is it's not just 3 dimensions, it's 4. I have no idea how that's going to look in a physical book, but no idea. It's in production.
Okay. Because
if you want, you can always go take a peek at the early part on my Patreon, which I guess go for it or don't, whatever. Okay. I can honestly say I don't pay too much attention to the Patreon other than as a place to post content. So that may or may not be of interest to anybody. I would probably not recommend it for people who are not very specifically interested in specific things. Because I'm a great salesman.
Yeah, you're really good at it. Yeah, I also heard that this is one of your biggest advances, that you are very good at selling your products. If I recall correctly, there is a post about you on Patrick Stewart blog, and you have commented there. I've read better, so yeah, yeah, very very good. Also wanted to ask about these random tables that you have mentioned, because there is a thing that comes to my mind. I really don't like random tables, for example, because I think there is a big lie in the OSR that everybody's using random tables, but secretly they don't, or they are pre-generating stuff. So it's really cool. Like, random tables can be a really great source of inspiration, in my opinion. Like, when I'm reading some products, some stuff, and I see random tables, and one sentence can spark the adventure in my mind. So they are great. But I think this is a valuable content. But I don't see how to use it on the fly. And they are, like you said, they repeat themselves. Usually when you are playing, for example, a mega dungeon, I have run Maze of the Blue Medusa recently, and also along with this planar campaign, and the random tables are repeating themselves. So
part of it, I think there's 2 distinctions. There's the random tables for within a dungeon and in the wilderness, and at a start, those 2 are different. So in the dungeon, the random table, I think, is, I won't touch on the way other people do things, because I think there's a lot of like having to see how that goes, but like when they run a game and they do things that works for them. But one of the things that I try and do, and for example, in the City of Tears and or Tears, is that there is a random encounter and monsters come from the nearest, to use the term, monster closet. So I would say dungeon lair. And the only thing that like it's meant to repeat itself, because what they do in the way that system that I have there set up is that they deplete from the pool that are hanging out in the lair. Like they are draining a resource from the monsters to a certain extent. Like if 10, in that one, cannibal crusaders come out to you, then the chapel that they lair from, like 10 of them move from that location to go chase you down. And now if you deal with them, there's 10 fewer in the other location. So it is kind of an interactive thing. It's not a problem that they repeat, because if those cannibal crusaders keep sending another 10 men after you, eventually when you go and bust in the place, there might only be 10 or 20 of them in there instead of 50 or 100 or any of those sort of things. It's kind of a required element. That's kind of a very workmanlike thing. Like that's within a dungeon, right?
But that also creates the environment, like overall, and the random encounters in this manner at least are disturbing the environment, that you are clearing some of the people or monsters that are living there. But usually they are a filler. Like every 10 minutes you have to throw for a random encounter, and then stuff happens.
Yeah, and I mean that depends. Like one of the things I have it is tied to activity rather than that's a whole other side conversation about NGR versus other OSR games. But even still, that's kind of in a dungeon. They are like if you just have monsters that just appear out of thin air and they're new monsters, like you rolled an ogre and there's no ogres on this level, but now here's an ogre. And I know some people use that. Yeah, that's kind of a bad thing. Like there's nothing interesting there. In the wilderness, I mean, you could have it the same way, and I do sometimes for very specific monsters. Like if you get the dragon and you kill the dragon, then now when you roll the dragon on the encounter table, nothing shows up because there's no dragon. You killed it. Like it's a way to show a danger in an area. But the repeating is there, I think, also really important. It's really important, and this comes, I guess, to one of the unspoken things that is important to how people design games is the length of a campaign, of the long game versus a short game. If your campaign is going to be like 6 weeks and, 4.5 sessions of that and, a missed session in between, then yeah, repeating encounters are kind of boring. Like you have a very condensed short area. But if you're going to have the type of long campaign that runs for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, then you need to have that level of repetition so that it is notable and memorable, more important than that, when something that breaks that comes up. So that, when you have, I've encountered more, I don't know, depending on your campaign setting, I have encountered more raiders from the hill people. 4 of them this time, 6 of them last time. And, sure, they probably cause problems with local hill people cultures. But then the next time you roll a giant, well, now because you weren't expecting a giant, because 4 times out of 5 you ran into hill people raiders, that makes that more memorable. It is the setting the baseline so that other things can pop up. Whereas if every time it was, this time it's monster of the week, on the encounter we get a giant, next time it's 2, I don't know, beholders or eye tyrants or whatever the thing that you're supposed to say instead of beholder is or fighting. If it's always interesting, then it's never interesting. You need to have some of that, I don't want to say doldrums, but that kind of more mundane baseline to make the other things stand out.
Yeah, I agree that with long campaign, it's definitely the case. That it also creates the overall environment when you have a long-term campaign and stuff is repeating. So yeah, definitely agree.
To touch on that note, and that's the second thing, is that if you're getting boring repeating results on your encounter tables, it's because you have done a poor job designing them. Like if they're always boring, it's like, 2 orcs or whatever you have that shows up, and it's not giving you interesting results. Well, you built the table, so put more effort into making one that gives you better results. There's a certain level with as acting as if the table that is boring and gives you boring results is just, who could have predicted that? Well, you made the table. If you make yourself a terrible, if you're a carpenter and you make yourself a terrible chair and it doesn't hold your weight, it's like, oh, well, I guess chairs are terrible. Well, no, you built a terrible chair. Build a better one.
Yeah. Yeah, true. So with this, with you were talking right now about monsters, about random tables, and what came to my mind is that I have asked recently when I was talking to Calvin Green and Patrick Stewart, I have asked them what is the least favorite part of the adventure when they are doing it, and they both told me that it is stats for the monsters. So I'm curious if you think the same.
Oh yeah, it's utterly terrible. Well, part of it is that, so one of the reasons why I designed, and I'll go into a brief diatribe here, a Neoclassical Geek Revival the way I do, is because, one, doing stats takes a lot of time, and I designed Neoclassical Geek Revival to be something for the busy GM. And so stats are entirely descriptive. You say, I want to have an elephant, you write down, an elephant with laser eyes and wings, you just write that down your notes. And then when it's time to game, you just kind of give it attributes on the fly as needed based on that description. And it's set up in such a way that you should be able to reliably get the same stats if you encounter another one of them 6 months later. If you look at OSR games, and, I don't want this to be like some sort of shit on the OSR because I do play. It's one of the only other games that I do play is old school games. But I call it the wolf problem. If you have a wolf in an adventure that you didn't write, or your GM didn't write, you have no idea how tough that wolf is. And it's all based upon the person who wrote that adventure. You see this in DCC sometimes as well, where I noticed it very strongly playing in a DCC campaign. Sometimes a wolf.
Okay guys, so here we had our first drop of the call, and we start again with the wolves topic.
So the wolf problem, which is where different writers will have different stats for a wolf, because again, a lot of the game stats are fairly abstract, like what does a hit dice mean, and it's kind of a measure of how dangerous something is, but then that comes very very subjective rather than objective. And so you have a question of what is a wolf? And some people who write adventures and think of them more as, oh yeah, it's like a dog. And so they'll have like a couple of hit points, maybe they'll attack you for a D4, and that's all you really need.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other people will have, well, a wolf is at least as tough as a great war dog, and it's 2 hit dice, which is twice as tough as an armored soldier, and it deals a D6 damage, which is equal to a sword. And then some will go even higher, and they're like 3 or 4 hit dice. Like a lion is, I think, in some editions, 6 hit dice. Well, what does that mean? I mean, can you not kill a lion with 1 arrow? And it all becomes very subjective. And so that also means that it gets very difficult to write consistent stats between different writers. So I think you had mentioned Patrick and Kelvin, and they both also go with Lamentations. So one of the things that I did that did not end up making the published cut, even though I did all this work, so I'm a teeny bit sore about it, with Barbarians of Orange Boiling Seas. So I actually went through and put in stats for all of the various megafauna and things like that. Here's a mammoth, here's a mastodon, here's a woolly rhino, here's a lion, just to try and have something like this is kind of what they're anticipated as being. But that is definitely not a fun portion, because it's just plunking in numbers for a creature. The fun part is thinking, there'll be a saber-toothed tiger here, waiting on this ledge, not, okay, so let's AC is leather plus shield, and it's got, like, at least for me, and it sounds like not for Patrick or Kelvin either, that is not the fun part. But it can be, because again, it depends on how if you're using a different game system, it might actually be fun to create stats based on if that's an interesting thing. But in general, I prefer after the fact stat creation. To me, it seems kind of boring to just have these disconnected numbers that you plug in based on, how tough you want the thing to be in terms of a challenge sense and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. So what is the most fun? What is generating the most fun when you are creating an adventure, an RPG product for you?
I mean, definitely the testing, in terms of the actual like overall fun. The thing that is probably, if you're kind of going with the part that is fun in the sense of something you can't help, then it's definitely the dumb jokes and Easter eggs. I really don't have anything good to say about myself for that one. For example, the adventure of the Pale Lady was literally about how many song lyrics I can get into an adventure without people noticing, and the answer was a ton. Like that was the thing I wanted to do with that adventure was how many song lyrics can I make into an adventure before people notice? And no one ever called me on it, including people who I know like the song.
Nice. It's I really like to hear these stories because it really sounds like I really like to hear when people are having fun with what they are creating and putting bits of something underneath the words, underneath the overall text. That's cool, really.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed, you mentioned you had talked to Kelvin, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of his adventures, if you notice, have a linked character that seems to appear in most of them.
Yeah, I noticed it a bit, but I'm not familiar with all of Kelvin's products. So yeah.
Just something to keep an eye on. I don't want to spoil things for people who are reading too much, but one of the things that I do think, and this is one of those other areas I know some people have differences of opinion, some reviewers, is that they want, and this is probably for some people, things to be very easy to read and use at the table. Whereas I am of a completely opposite view, that is kind of planning for failure. Is the ideal thing I want to have happen is for the adventure to be, for lack of a better term, sticky enough that it sticks in your memory, the basic moving pieces of what things are important. And if you need to look up or fudge the odd little detail, it's not a problem because the core elements you've got in your brain. For example, you've looked at, I'll put some spoilers here for people who haven't read GTFO. The layout of the complex is kind of a nave church structure, like the central function of it. So you can kind of remember that layout. And then there's, kind of zonal layouts that are important to either side of it. Here's where like there'd be a secret. Here's the autopsy room. Like there's a strong thing that you could remember. And so it is possible to largely run that or even fully run that without really needing to crack open that book once you have the moving pieces, like you probably will for reference if people really dig into the details on some individual thing. But it is not designed for you to be like having the old school GM screen with this open behind the book and you reading from it instead of making eye contact with the players. And a lot of them are like that, the adventures I write that are meant to be sticky. Or they're meant to be something where you read it ahead of time and generate it, like Dunnsmouth. I would never expect anyone to have all of that. But when you do the prep work of designing the town, it's hopefully creating a thing that is sticky enough that you don't need to reference the book much. You might need for like some little detail, like, oh, how much exactly money did they have, or that sort of thing. But even still, those would be during the kind of the slow periods of the game. Like you don't need to know that in like a tense moment in the game where people are doing something exciting or dangerous. That's the sort of thing where like, oh, and they get back to their temporary camp and they look up what's in the valuables. And it's like, oh, it's this many coins. Mm-hmm. It's not like they'd be counting them during the adventure when they're doing a smash and grab or whatever they're doing.
When it comes for the Dunnsmouth, it's also, I have to say that it is the first adventure that I had fun when preparing to run to. So it generated a ton of fun for me when I was doing the village, when I was throwing the dice, and it was just fun. I was really excited to see what comes out. So yeah.
Well, that is another one of those little mini rants I have about the people forgetting the GM as a player. So one of the things that I really hate to see online, but I'm getting better about just remembering not to bother talking to people online because random internet comments aren't going to change anyone's opinion.
Exactly.
Is the idea that a lot of things are somehow the GM's responsibility, like solving interpersonal problems between people or doing any of these sort of things. And the from my point of view, the GM is just a player to the point where when I get really twee and stupid and pretentious, hitting that perfect blend of, I believe Jeff Rance had the retro, stupid, pretentious threefold model years and years ago. When I try and hit the perfect, balance of all three of them, is to make sure the GM is known as the referee and the players are known as the storytellers. You're the ones who do something interesting. It is your job to make sure that what you do with this setting is interesting for the GM, not the other way around. And so part of that means that I try and focus on things for the GM to have fun instead of being kind of the person who is serving up fun on a platter to others.
Yeah, because players will have fun anyway, I think.
Or rather, that's their job to make fun for everybody. It's a social activity. People are getting together. It's not the GM's job to make sure everyone has fun. Like, it's not, to a certain extent, there's some, like if you look at a party, the host has some obligation to make sure people have fun, but it's also the people at the party who need to make sure other people have fun. Like, we're not robots here. We're expected to have basic social skills.
Yeah, if you are organizing a dance-off, then as a host, you can put on the music, but people still have to dance. So, yeah, I totally get the point. So, what made you go with NGR, with Neoclassical Geek Revival? What pushed you to create your own rule set?
I am just an impossible perfectionist and tinkerer, which may surprise no one to know that, like, one of the first things I started doing when I first got a computer, a 286, was trying to reprogram games to fix things I considered wrong, which in those days was like the days of blind modding. There was no internet, there was no manuals or anything. It's just changing weird symbols and data files until you get like small changes. So a lot of that was like wasted hours other than the obsessiveness. But it is a just constant iterative. And, as the years got by, there's been less and less to tinker with and fix because it runs smoothly enough to how I want to run a game, so that the type of adventures that I like to run just kind of flow naturally. They take less work to develop. Players start generating their own adventures, things along those lines. So it's just, I guess, kind of a need to have a system that I don't have to fight, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. You wanted to have your RPG plays, your like something that you're familiar with and that you like. So that sounds reasonable, definitely. Yeah. So
I guess I should mention there is a Kickstarter for that, or Josh, the guy who runs the business side of things, will, like, you couldn't mention that. Yeah, there's a Kickstarter, Google it or whatever.
I wanted to mention it at the end, but yeah, we can do it right now, definitely. So
there
no
you
problem.
Go. There's my crass capitalism. Buy it or don't, whatever. We've already funded. I don't need your money.
By the way, you have the worst sales text on Kickstarter I have ever seen. So also that's
wrote that part myself.
Yeah, I thought really, because Josh is a very communicative and nice guy, and when I saw the text on the Kickstarter, I thought, okay, Zzarchov definitely did that one. Yeah.
Well, I hopefully just try and keep, like, there's a certain level of where I don't want to be too much of a salesperson, because that implies a level of professionalism that I do not want to have.
So like you do not want NGR to be a company?
I guess I would say I'm not as concerned as if it is. Like, I understand, that helps people out. Like, there's artists and that sort of thing, and it generates things. But functionally, I like other people playing because they can give feedback. That's really it. And so to a certain extent, I'm only really concerned if you're the type of person who would like that type of game anyways.
Okay. So
for example, I am very much an anti-sell, because I wouldn't want anyone to buy this book expecting one thing and then getting something completely different. I try and make it very much, it is what it says on the tin.
I understand, but I think I don't want to be too much harsh, but I think when it comes to NGR, There is a bunch of people in the hobby that they actually don't like how the OSR plays, but they like the OSR idea. And I saw that people who are not playing NGR but have heard about it, they think it is the sweet spot between I don't like the OSR rule set, but I like the modules, and will NGR give me the new school the new school D&D feeling with the old school modules. I think right now we have this big amount of people searching this connection between, because modules are cool but the rule sets are lame, so we want the connection, and they keep digging, and this is what I heard and what I read, even along the Polish internet, that NGR starts to come up as this connection between new school and old school. So I don't know, do you agree with it?
So one of the interesting things about how I got kind of into the OSR is that I didn't. I was just kind of there puttering and doing my own thing, and then the OSR came as this great surge around me, and I was kind of in the place that was there, and on Constant Con gaming with the right people, and so I'm kind of swept up with the tide, but I'm still mostly just functioning on and tinkering with my own things. I did put out a little pay what you want rule set called Obligatory Sample Rules that showcase a little bit. Here's what I do when I am running an OSR game, because I do run OSR games as the lingua franca. But like everybody, I don't really need a rule book for it. I just have the very simple, it has an armor class. You roll above that on the D20, you hit, and you do damage from the weapon, a D6 or maybe a D8 if it's a big one or something. Like very simple, streamlined. The kind of D&D that people can just kind of run, your D&D. You know what I mean? You don't need a book. You can just sit down. You know what the 6 stats are. You know what a hit point is. And all the fine minutia details that would happen in a longer game don't really matter, because you're playing like a 1 or a 2 shot maybe at like a convention or something. Which is where I usually run it. But then for NGR is designed a little more for the longer term game, where you kind of do need those fiddly bits. Like, it could be that you just create them as rulings, but then now you got to remember that ruling for the next time it comes up. And so, that's more cognitive load on the GM to come up with those things, which, is one of my gripes about some of the versions of role-playing games, that they seem to offload a bunch of work onto the GM. I have a number of various rants about that on, for example, where they have a large number of, in some versions of it more than others, player options that focus a lot more work on the GM to create balanced encounters or that sort of things, which are fun for the players. Totally get why you enjoy playing that, but I've noticed there seems to be, therefore, a shortage of GMs. Like, one of the things I've noticed is if you're playing a game like, I think it's Pathfinder's the new 3.5 kind of.
Yeah, and second edition came out. Yeah.
That you can find a lot of players for that, but a real shortage of GMs. Just whenever I look vaguely online, and I will see, for example, in old school games, you have the opposite situation, where there is a real abundance of GMs, but a little bit of a shortage of players for it. And I think that kind of feeds into the same idea of player options versus the amount of work that puts on the GM. That's my completely unresearched, terrible hot take that I'll be crucified on.
Yeah, but these are usually the ones that are on point. So, yeah, I agree, because to be honest, I'm kind of at two worlds, because on one part I really like the minimalistic D&D, like the OSR. I really like it. I can say that I really do. But on the other hand, I was introduced to D&D on 3rd edition, and I really like 4th edition. And this is something that people, or when I always tell it, that people really look like I'm stupid or something. But I really did like this edition, and I was playing it 8 years, and with my friends, and we had really long-term campaigns playing D&D 4th edition. But then we grew up and changed our tastes, our time our time. We couldn't even play 12-hour sessions anymore because we had our jobs, we had our families, and
well, that's actually great. If we did want to talk about NGR a little bit, and I can bring that up as a great segue, because one of the things that it is specifically designed for, and I've had tongue in cheek for some of the little special supplements like Tools for the Lazy GM with it, is that it is meant for a certain extent when you're a little older, because when you're younger, you have that large amount of time that the extra time it takes for prep work for some games is really not a problem. Like I'm just coming with old manism out here. But when you're 14, you got a lot of free time to come up with stats for monsters and unique, like all those sort of things that point of time. Like you still create the interesting, as much as to a 14-year-old comes up with interesting shit that isn't derivative, but things you think are interesting and not derivative when you're 14. All those unique parts, but you also have the spare time that you need to do the less fun part. They're creating the stats and the balancing encounters and doing all of that sort of stuff. But then as you become a busy adult with many busy adult things to do, you don't have that much prep time anymore. Like you can't sit there and work out the feat progression for a 17th level fighter with his like various bonus actions and weird bonuses and things like that. That takes 40 minutes to come up with, because you may only have like 2 hours to prep for your game or for your next 2 games. So you need to be a lot more concise. And that was definitely one of the pressures with NGRs to make it. And as I've mentioned, and after the fact, it is a descriptivist rather than a prescriptivist system.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, people got stuff to do.
Yeah. So I think this is why we right now are experiencing this flood of minimalistic rule sets overall. I think overall through RPG, like small rule sets are hot right now, I think.
I would say yes. The reason I think you keep seeing so many of them is because they're not going to hit the sweet spot that people want, which is they are minimalistic and they're great for like one-offs. But I think there is, at least among some people, a certain hunger to have the longer campaigns, the ones that run for, weeks, months, years. Mm-hmm. And even though minimalistic makes it real easy to prep for a session, at least in my experience, they make it much more difficult to have a campaign that is interesting.
I know where you're going, and I agree, because I recently ended this campaign where I mixed up a lot of products and had this planner campaign, and it was I think 10 months of week in week out playing 4 to 5 hours per week, and we were playing on a white box fantastic medieval adventure games rule set. And at the beginning, it was this core D&D where it was just D20, D6, and nothing else. But with the progression of the campaign, we expanded the rules. We created some home rules, some additional rules, some new abilities sometimes, and yeah, you want something more when you are progressing, because to feel the progress of not even of the player character, but also the agenda and the power, maybe not the power in terms of muscle strength, but the power that character wields even with its authority. So yeah, you want additional rules when playing a long-term campaign.
Well, I don't even necessarily know if it's that you want them so much as you get them whether you want them or not. As the nature of rulings, not rules. Once you make a ruling, you've effectively added a new rule to the game. You just haven't written it down anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so the longer you play, you'll build up a whole set of rules. I mean, that's very much what happened with Gygax, right? He had a nice, clean set of rules and then started making rulings, and he started writing those rulings down, and then he published them in AD&D. I'm sure there's probably a whole bunch of things in there that are shenanigans and stuff involving legal trouble and lawsuits and whatnot, but I'm just going to skip over that and paint a very rosy picture of the beginning.
Yeah, that's what I think when I flip Lamentations rulebook and see stuff about housing and how to buy a property. So yeah, I see that probably maybe James Raji had this somewhere in his campaign and thought that it is good to have it in your rulebook. Yeah.
And if it shows up in his campaign a bunch, then absolutely it is. If that's the type of game that he runs, where housing prices and that matter, then go for it.
Yeah.
Like the rules start showing up for the things that you do a lot.
So do you, on a weekly basis, or I don't know how often do you game, but so you are mainly running your NGR, yes?
For running, yeah, I run 2 NGR campaigns that are usually to some degree of competing, 2 groups in the same world or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a player in a number of games, a 5e games, some OSR games, Warhammer, of various schedules and things like that. And every now and again, I try to pick up just random anonymous 5e games, just so I can kind of see and kind of stay a little bit grounded on what the gaming environment is. It's very easy to fall into kind of a tunnel vision of the various gaming scenes that you might be in, of how game progresses, but then sometimes you need to pop into just a random, like, 4 people who are playing 5e and sit through a 20-minute conversation about, if a tabaxi can, like, I think that's a cat person. I was never 100% sure on that.
Yes,
backstab a peasant and get away with it if, like, they can eat the corpse, and just things that you think have almost receded into the myths of internet memery, but apparently there's still real problems going off in games. So keeps me a little bit grounded, I guess, on, the old questions. There's a whole new generation of people who are legitimately having actual fights about role player or role player. And apparently nothing ever changes. The wheel keeps on turning.
Yeah, I'm in a hobby. I don't know if only about 16 years, but people don't change in these terms, at least. Yeah. So it's interesting because are you as a designer, as a producer, as a publisher as well? Because recently you have started, not so recently, but you have started to publish your own stuff.
Only like a decade ago.
Yeah.
Fairly recently.
Yeah.
Just the other day.
So, do you feel like being a designer takes some fun out of playing or out of running a game, or is it bothering you at all, or not?
I don't find it does. If it does, then either you're designing wrong or you should not. I mean, one of the things I think you need to do as a designer very clearly and very strongly is still play, both as a player character and as a game master, like play in both seats. Because it is very important to kind of remember what you're actually doing. And what I mean by that is not that, like, oh, I'm writing this for a player, but what a player actually is as a person sitting in a chair, building a tower of dice, running through these situations. Because it is very easy and I think everyone's seen this with anyone who's good at anything, like anyone who directs movies and gets really popular, at some point starts drinking their Kool-Aid and they stop editing their movies appropriately and they become kind of messes. You see the same thing. Some of Guy Gax's later works seem to be like he never actually played them. And I think it's important that you, like, it's one thing to play test, but I think it's also important that you, as a general rule, as a designer, both play and jam in games to kind of remember what this is going to be like when it's at an actual physical table, when there's actual human beings flipping through a book or rolling dice or looking at character sheets and interacting with the words that you've written down.
That's very interesting, because usually people, when I see designers, usually they are hardcore dungeon masters only. So
I think that risks a little bit of myopia, forgetting that what is fun for the dungeon master or interesting for the dungeon master might not be fun for the other side of the table, and that you need to kind of make sure that, as much as there's the tyranny of I hate fun, that is, I believe, Raju was the original one to publish that, which is important. Like, every session and every moment doesn't have to be fun, but there does have to be enjoyment from the situation as a whole. And so you need to be able to kind of put yourself in, whenever you're designing any element of something, how's this going to be for the GM to manage this? How's this going to be for the player? How's this going to be for a group of players? And kind of put yourself in different seats. Like, is this puzzle going to be fun for players to interact with? Is it going to be a nightmare for the GM to manage? Is it going to be, to make sure that when you're running these things, that you don't have too much of the time where you're putting a bunch of onus on one person's enjoyment, like one role. Much like, for example, even if you have something that is fun for a player, you have to think, is this going to be fun for the entire table? And if not, how long is this going to go on? There's the classic problem that you would hear people call the thief problem. So I always liked the cyberpunk version of the hacker problem. If you went to the original or older cyberpunk and Shadowrun type games, where you'd have a scene where the hacker does a bunch of stuff and everyone else just sits around watching them do stuff. And then that ends, and then everyone else does an adventure and they just kind of sit around and watch. Which, if you're thinking about this in terms of a meta level of everyone doing things at like a physical table, isn't for the best if you're trying to get people to have memorable moments, because you're kind of isolating people. It's almost like you're having two games. Like, one person could wander off until you call them from another room and they wander back over. Mm-hmm. And so it's the same thing with anything you create. You want to make sure that multiple people at the table, whereas that GM, player, whatever role they're in, are doing something at the same time. And ideally, most of them are having fun, and you don't have a situation like, everyone can't be having all the fun all the time, but where it works out overall to be enjoyable.
And to have the perspective of everyone at the table, I think both parties, like GM and the players, it's important. Yeah.
And ideally, multiple types of players as well. Because, again, you're going to have a mix of people at the table, and you want to try and make sure that you're not only catering to one type of player. Assuming that there's going to be a mix of different player types, and I don't mean any of the like real classic types of that you always see of like, oh, Munchkin or role player or any of those sort of things. I mean, different human personality types, people who have short attention spans, people who are like love puzzles and math. And while every adventure, even every session, doesn't have to appeal to everybody, you need to make sure that eventually there is a blend in there.
Yeah. So I wanted to also to stick a bit, also slowly going to wrap it up. But I wanted to ask you, maybe if you could, how if someone would ask you what NGR brings to the table as an RPG rule set, how would you shortly describe it to someone completely new? I know you're a terrible salesman, but yeah, maybe we can.
First, I would ask, how dare you talk to me directly like an equal? Then, once I have finished sneering at them, I would describe it to a certain extent that. See, that's a hard thing to do. Because to a certain extent, you actually have to sit through and play it a bit, because it's fundamentally trying to have the same type of genre. Like, if I focus on a lot of the description of D&D, it very much tries to do a lot of the same things of D&D, but it has a very different starting output and focus. So it is focused very much so around the dynamics of the physical table, and that its purpose, rather than to be a great game, is to be a great element of a social event. So there's a number of things in there I've seen that people kind of I'll stick to one part at the end that I like to explain. At the end of NGR, there's a bit at the end where you go and you roll for awesomeness, it's called. And you go through the things in the adventure, you vote for an MVP, and you go and you describe bits of your character and why they're awesome. And so the examples I have in there are like, oh, do you have a manly beard? Do you have 80s hair? You get a bonus if you have an eye patch. You get a bigger bonus if you need the eye patch. You have a cape. And all of those things are there, and people think, oh, I guess this is just like you think it's goofy that there's a beard. And those are very much there because they're ridiculous. And they're walking you through a checklist of getting you to try to not take the game so seriously as a start. Then they go through where you recount various things you get, where you took extra risk for style. And the reason this is in here is two-part. One, as I mentioned with the memory, to kind of spoil behind the curtain, having people recount what they've done is going to make it cement in people's minds, and it's specifically they're going to be recounting it from the bits they found interesting. So you've kind of got everyone around the table coming together to recount the interesting things that just happened, which are going to make it more memorable, more so than the original event, the retelling of it. The second thing it does, and this is important as I mentioned with the dynamics of the group as a whole, is by specifically phrasing it as where you have taken suboptimal choices and you get a Benny at the end of it, a reroll basically. I think in D&D now they call it inspiration, but I refuse to change 10-year-old terms due to some Johnny-come-lately. I also refuse to use the terms advantage and disadvantage, even though they're lingua franca now, and it would be way easier in sections of the rulebook. I refuse.
Here we have our second drop of the call, and we start again with Zzarchov describing Neoclassical Geek Revival.
Playing havoc with the power and internet.
No problem. So okay, let's maybe start to wrap it up. Just for you to finish your sentence, you told that you refuse to call it disadvantage and advantage.
Which is what the little bit of a Benny is. What that allows is for two different types of players, assuming you're playing with people who you want to hang around with and not people who want to play a particular game, you're probably going to have a mix of personality types. And so you're going to have some who are very efficient, very tactical, and then you're going to have some people who want to fudge around a little more. And by giving this incentive, this useful tactical option of these rerolls, to the group who kind of want to fudge around more, you've created a, albeit shaky, tactical reason for them to be doing things like sleeping when they're supposed to be keeping watch, or, trusting that the, old lady is not going to poison them when she offers them tea, even though she very likely is from a meta level. And so you can kind of smooth out the tension between the two, because I don't know about you, but perhaps at some point you've seen where there is, especially when a long-term character might die, a tension between the person who wants to kind of go with the flow of the world versus the person who knows what the tactically correct choice is.
Yeah,
this
definitely.
is one of those examples of a rule to kind of smooth that together, not for the benefit of the game as its own thing, like game mechanically, if you were to look at that, sure, there's a right choice and a wrong choice. But from the idea of having people who you want to hang around with kind of have that moment where they kind of less likely to bump heads. They have behavioral nudges to go into kind of a direction. And so they can, not have a blow up in 5 years and kill each other. They can, have this thing will help generate memories that they will talk about and laugh about and shoot the breeze about, 10 years later sort of thing. And so it's all kind of focused on little, I guess the psychological term is nudges to get people to kind of naturally behave in certain ways. There's other things, for example, killing or causing an opponent to flee, you get a 10% value of their XP. If you capture them, 25%. So you have those kind of built in, well, that means people are more likely to try and capture an opponent. If you capture an opponent instead of murdering them all, which doesn't mean don't murder them, because if you capture them, there's a good chance they can escape and cause a problem later. If you murder them, that just gets rid of it. Now there are incentives to do the sorts of things that naturally generate more stories, more, make your work easier as a GM because now you've got a recurring villain because, yeah, they handed him over to the police or brought him in dead or alive, and they chose alive so he could be recurring.
Mm-hmm.
And it did that without being heavy-handed, without having any sort of plot armor. Oh, he escapes in a puff of smoke. You make it now a choice. Do they want to kill this guy before he can finish his monologue, or they want to let him finish and then capture him and then get more XP? Knowing that there is now that extra risk that they wouldn't have if they just put 2 in his head. And so it's those sorts of small little changes throughout the entire thing. I've had it described by who used to be a fairly prominent OSR blogger before he went on to do actual good in the world in the Peace Corps, Ian Burns, who described it as a take on the original rules to the point that none of the original rules survive, which I always liked. So that is, I guess, my little spiel on that. I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else I can give you insight on as to my self-important blowhard logic behind why I do things?
Yeah, there is one. So when recently last year when I don't know if we want to talk about it, but when
that's probably a good indication, no, but let's go anyways. What's up?
Okay, so why are you no longer publishing, for example, under Lamentations? Why are you not? Because it seems like you just want to go your path with your path, yes, with NGR fully, or?
Well, I've always been publishing NGR, but
I know. But
to be really blunt about it, Raji has a very strong view and brand. And when I create an adventure, like if I have an idea that comes up that suits that, that's fine. But a lot of the stuff I work with tends to have a little bit more of a fairy tale vibe, whereas he tends to go more towards the cosmic horror. And sometimes they overlap. An adventure like The Punchline, it works neither of those. But, even something like The Pale Lady, which, he was a good sport and went along with, it deals with the fairy folk and that sort of thing. And that's not really the vibe that he's kind of looking for. But generally, when I write adventures, I don't usually. I did with going through Forbidden Otherworlds and Barbarians of Orange Boiling Seas. Those were written for Lamentations. And a large part of that, as I mentioned, was me being a dumb juvenile and being able to pull over a 2-year-long joke on Raji. But no, it's nothing that I am specifically not working with Raji. It's just I have not had any adventures that I've come up with that I think are really up his tone.
Okay. So one thing also I wanted to ask is it may sound stupid, but where do you get your inspiration from when you are thinking about an adventure? Is this a song? Is this a book, a movie, or what sparks you to create a product?
It could be a number of different sources. I try and feed a lot of different things into the mental gristmill as it is. I do read a lot, though more when I was younger. Movies I'm a huge fan of, especially older, what I will call bad movies. People used to be willing to take a lot more of a risk when movies weren't as multi-billion-dollar investments. And so even really terrible movies will sometimes, and ones not related to the genre, will have good concepts that can spark something in that. Just some little thing. Music, yeah, I like a fair amount of music, but it's probably not as large of an inspiration for me as a number of other people. But then if I had to go with the final one, sometimes it's just a walk in nature. Nature is pretty red in tooth and claw and absolutely horrific if you pay close enough details. You can get a lot out of that sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. And even when I was talking to Patrick, he told me that just learning more about caves just made him think about stuff that he could implement it in veins of the earth. Yeah. So
we live in a wonderful world where the internet is at your fingertips, and you can get a lot of information on a lot of really niche things. And so if you dig into enough weird places, you'll probably find something interesting, something that you think there's the seed of an adventure there. And of course, there's also the true source of all inspiration, but that's a carefully guarded secret that people who write things don't share with others, because then the gig's up and we'd have to do something else.
All right, I would ask what it is, but you will definitely not tell me. So
have to tell you off camera of the super secret well of all inspiration.
Okay, so last silly question will be, what's your favorite art in your book, or out of all of your products?
Oh, that is easy. That is the cover of Thulian Echoes. If nothing else, I can know that I have enriched the human experience by being part of what caused that masterful piece of art to come to existence. That is the cover, the great painting with the heirloom and the legionnaire and the rabbi beating the gladiator to death in the middle of an astral field. If nothing else, then 10,000 years when that picture is hung in some art gallery with people having no idea what it symbolizes, I can know that is part of the great human experience. I have led to that.
Yeah, I gotta say this one is great, and I would say this, and I have a special feeling in my heart for overall art in the Punchline. It's because it's great.
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic work throughout the Punchline. The artist there did a phenomenal job. The layout is good too. Yeah, it's a great work there. I think the art in the Punchline is phenomenal. But if you're asking personal, the cover for Thulian Echoes, that piece of art is brilliant. It speaks to me.
Okay, so to wrap it up, everyone who will be hearing this, you are right now running a Kickstarter for NGR. I think right now you are out on this biggest pledge. It's sold out completely. Yes, 100 of them are right now sold out.
I haven't even looked.
Jesus Christ.
I was told that it funded, and then I no longer had to care in any way, shape, or form. Because again, I am terrible at this.
Great. Yeah. So
buy it or don't, whatever. I don't
happy
care.
to inform you that and that people who wanted to have 1,000 Babies in Gloams of Levnek in print, I think right now they're out of option. So, but you are running a Kickstarter which has funded already. So I guess congratulations on this one. More stuff coming from you, what you have said in the future. Yes, is it a near future or next year?
I mean, I'm done my part. So whenever the other part of the production schedule comes out, there's going to be map and arting and layout. I have no idea how the hell they're going to do that. It's actually because I initially had that written up like 5 years ago, but I cannot for the life of me figure out how to produce a 4-dimensional dungeon in a 2-dimensional book. But that's now someone else's problem, and they can come up with something or go mad in the attempt, and that's on them now.
All right. So we have to keep we have to stay waiting patiently. So yeah. And for now, I guess thank you very much for having this conversation. It went longer than I thought it will go, but I'm really happy that we touched all of these topics, and I could really go on even longer, but I don't want to steal more of your time, and with the problems that we are having with the connection, I guess it will be healthy right now to maybe stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the conversation, and hopefully I'll talk to you again at some point.
Yes, I will happily host you anytime you will want. So just let me know. So thanks.
Okay, take care.